Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to be joined again by Professor Youshaa Patel. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Haji Paul. Wonderful to be back.
Good, yeah, we're lovely to have you back. For those who don't recall, Dr. Youshaa is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Lafayette College, a liberal arts college located in Pennsylvania, USA. His scholarship explores Islamic scripture and tradition with a focus on how Islam has shaped and been shaped by Muslim interfaith encounters in the Middle East and beyond. He earned his PhD in religious studies from Duke University in the States. This fall, he will be the Abdul Aziz Al Muwatta Visiting Fellow at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford here in the UK. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Youshaa did a fascinating video on blogging theology titled, Can Muslims Imitate Non-Muslims? An Islamic Examination. Today, he will give us a further presentation, and this will be extended from his first presentation, partly in response to viewer comments to the last video, but also he will explore, inshallah, other issues based on his recently published book, The Muslim Difference, which discusses Muslims imitating non-Muslims. So, sir, over to you.
Thank you. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillahil Kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. La ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka anta 'alimun hakim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Ya Fattahun, Ya Alimun, iftah lana fathan qariban. Okay, so what I want to do is I'll give a brief overview of the overall presentation, lecture, talk, however you want to describe it, which builds on the first presentation and talk that we did a couple of weeks ago, which I really enjoyed, and partly in response to some viewer comments and questions, and partly kind of reflecting back on the presentation and thinking that this is a complex topic that one could do a series on, an entire course on in reality. But there are some things that I wanted to discuss in more detail and more depth. I wanted to review a few things and hopefully answer some of the questions that may have been lingering in the minds of some of your viewers, and in all likelihood provoke some more questions and comments as we proceed. So what I'm going to do now is just give a brief outline of the presentation and the trajectory that we're going to take today. So first, I'm going to do a brief recap for those who may not have had an opportunity to see the first presentation. Of course, it's advisable to, but not.
Yeah, I'll link it in the description below, folks. If you haven't seen it, do watch and you want to watch it, do watch the first part. You can click on the link below.
Fantastic. I'll do a brief recap. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Islamic orthodoxy and thinking about what it is and how the subject matter at hand of tashabu, as we're going to explore imitating others, figures into that. I'll discuss briefly the middle way, religio-cultural sharedness as it relates to Muslims, of course. What practices does tashabu, and I'll once again talk about this term, include? What are the Islamic rulings on tashabu, which is something that we didn't really get a chance to talk about last time, but I think will hopefully be beneficial for those who are interested in this, the more fiqh side of things. And then once again, something we didn't really have a chance to talk about in much detail, but just to think a little bit more detail or give more attention to Muslims living in the West, and then opportunities for Q&A and questions that you may have, Paul. Not to say that you can't interject. Of course, you're more than welcome to. In fact, it makes.
But just on that penultimate point, Muslims, I will be asking you about the recent incident in France where the French government have unilaterally decided to tell young Muslim women what they can and cannot wear of a particular item of clothing in French schools, which has generated a huge amount of reaction, most of it entirely negative, I think. So I'm going to ask you about that, inshallah. But in the meantime, over to you.
Fantastic. So briefly to the recap.
Okay.
So once again, what I want to do is begin with this hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which really anchors this topic, this subject of imitating non-Muslims. So once again, in Arabic, for interested learners, man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum, which I've translated here as whoever imitates a people becomes one of them. It's a canonical hadith. It's collected by Abu Dawood, but by many others like Ahmed ibn Hanbal, Abdul Razak, and others. The gradings of this hadith on the scale of weak, fabricated, good, sahih, or sound, or authentic. There's a bit of some disagreement because of the transmitters, some disagreement on the narrators, on the ruwat of this hadith. But I think we can confidently say that it's a hadith, at least according to traditional methods of grading hadith, that we can say is sahih li ghayrihi. Not necessarily intrinsically sahih, but at the very least because of the bulk and the number of narrations, the quantity of narrations that we have of this hadith, one that elevates what might be considered a hasan narration to one that is sahih li ghayrihi, or extrinsically sahih, extrinsically authentic. Now, this hadith anchors the subject of imitating non-Muslims because it is, despite its pithiness, tremendously potent. So it is an example of what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself called his capacity to, as he says in a hadith, "Bu'ithtu bi jawami al-kalim." I was sent by God to convey big, expansive meanings, or with the capacity to convey big, expansive meanings in a small quantity of words. So in other words, granted the capacity with economy of speech, but speech that is saturated with meaning and significance. And that was a gift that our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had. And this hadith is an excellent example of that. So in the initial presentation, I opened up with the figure of Muhammad Asad, who lived in the 20th century and drew upon this hadith to argue that Muslims, Muslims should be different. Muslims should be proud of being different and shouldn't be afraid of doing so, whether in majority Muslim context or non-majority Muslim context. And this hadith was a key factor for him. So one of the reasons why we can consider it such a potent hadith and why it drew so much attention, by later Muslim scholars was because it speaks about some big topics. For example, identity and alterity, or perhaps more simply, our relationship between self and other. This is a huge topic, right? Any human being has to confront or at least deal with the idea of who am I and who else is out there in the world and how am I going to interact with them. This hadith is is a hadith that connects and relates to this idea of shaping the relationship between self and other. It also links these big topics, once again, of becoming, belonging, and identity. It ties them together and says that, if you emulate or imitate a particular group or people, you become like them. So it also, that becoming, that process of self-cultivation, self-transformation is connected to belonging. So in other words, the connection between the individual and the social, the individual and the collective, and how that defines one's identity. This hadith speaks directly to this social dynamic. And if you think about the Sahaba, for example, why do we value the Sahaba companionship? It shows how important having companions was to the Prophet's mission. And even to our own practice of Islam, we look to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as an exemplar, but we also look to his companions to learn what Islam is. But this speaks to a much broader social process, that our identities are defined not just by ourselves, but through our interactions with others. And this hadith draws attention to this very complex process in such a small number of words. And then finally, another reason why it continues to draw attention today is because it helps to illuminate the relationship between religion and culture, which is another very important topic, especially, I would say especially, but really for Muslims everywhere. I could argue it's especially salient to Muslims living in Western countries, North America, Europe, Australia, etc. But it really is important to Muslims everywhere. What is the connection and relationship between religion and culture? And imitation is a subject, and emulation and assimilation are subjects that bring this relationship into the foreground rather to the background. So these are some reasons why this hadith is so deep, it's so profound. One could have an entire course on this hadith alone. In fact, I've written so much about it because it is just so fertile for thinking about these really big picture topics that I think would thrill any intellectually inclined Muslim or non-Muslim for that matter.
Mm.
So once again, to this key Arabic term that I spoke of in the last presentation, just to remind viewers, number one, what the term is and how to pronounce it, tashabuh, fifth form in the Arabic. And even though I translated as imitation the majority of the time, its semantic field is in fact more expansive and encompasses English terms such as mimesis, simulation, assimilation, mimicry, and resemblance. And one wouldn't be wrong in certain contexts to translate tashabbuh with any one of these terms. And people have, and people continue to do so. So I just want to give viewers an understanding that even though I will use imitate for a majority of this presentation, please keep in mind that this Arabic term is in fact more expansive than the term imitation and encompasses these other English terms as well. And once again, thinking about the subject matter in relation to other forms of imitation within the Islamic normative tradition, we can, and this is just a schematic, it's an oversimplified schematic, but it's one that I also mentioned in the previous presentation, and just as a reminder and as a review for viewers to see tashabbuh within the broader context of imitation within the Islamic tradition. So we know, and we've heard, we commonly hear the idea of ittiba' sunnah, the idea of following the sunnah of the Prophet is something that is good, intrinsically good for believers to do if they want to become pious, come close to God, come to love the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in both inward and outward matters. Another form of imitation that is considered broadly positive is taqleed, and that's often in the context of following a school of law or a madhab. And I have asterisks once again by tashabbuh and taqleed because sometimes these terms are not necessarily good or bad. So tashabbuh can be good, and taqleed can also be perceived as a negative thing. So just to kind of review imitation within the broader conceptual landscape of the Islamic tradition, and to position and see tashabbuh, the idea of a kind of a reprehensible imitation that emerged within Islamic tradition, Islamic discourse. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And so once again, the kind of conceptual connection between negative imitation and being different is that if tashabbuh is an Arabic term in the hadith, in traditions, conveys something of an imitation that Muslims should shun, that Muslims should avoid, then the implication is that it's also a command, as it were, or an exhortation to be different. So if I tell Paul, do not imitate Scottish people and by wearing a kilt, just hypothetically, right?
Not a problem. Not a problem, sir.
I was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. Nothing against the
Scotland. Oh, were you? I didn't know that. Gosh. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so if I said, I make that encouraged Paul to do that, and I encourage you to do that, that would also be, by implication, an encouragement to be different, to be distinct, to stand out. So just to draw a connection between not imitating or bad imitation and being different. In some ways, being different is the positive command, whereas do not imitate is a negative command. But the implication and the effect, the rhetorical effect is the same or similar at the very least. So that is a brief recap of some of the key points I wanted to bring up from the previous presentation, and I wanted to just now move on and move forward and go in more depth into some topics that we may not have had an opportunity to discuss in the level of detail that I wanted to. So if it wasn't apparent, if it isn't apparent now, and if it wasn't apparent in the first presentation, I would like to make it apparent now that this topic, this subject of imitating others, the subject of tashabu, relates to how we think of Islamic orthodoxy. Islamic orthodoxy is a kind of a fancy way that religious studies folks talk about correct Islam or correct Christianity or correct Judaism. What is the correct form of belief? What is the correct form of practice? In fact, correct practice has its own specific nomenclature, orthopraxy. But orthodoxy is kind of a broad term that speaks to any like normative attempt by religious practitioners, religious thinkers to define what is correct belief and practice and what is incorrect belief and practice. So that's kind of what we're talking about here for those who may not be familiar with this terminology. Often how Sunni Islamic orthodoxy is kind of portrayed is through this dialectic between Sunnah and Bid'ah. And I know you've had at least one guest to talk about what Bid'ah is. So Bid'ah, for those who may not be familiar, is innovation, but a bad kind of innovation in especially ritual practice. So if Brother Paul, sent out a tweet today that said, it is now obligatory for all Muslims to pray 6 times a day. And that is the actual way of practicing correct Islam. That would be a very blatant example of innovation or bid'ah, of a heretical innovation, a reprehensible innovation that I'm sure would draw a lot of condemnation and criticism and say that's bid'ah, that is not the sunnah, and that is not correct Islam. So often the way defining correct Islam is portrayed as a dialectic between sunnah and bid'ah. We should imitate the sunnah, we should follow it, and we should not innovate or diverge or deviate, which is a common word you often hear, from it. And that's all fine and dandy. But what I want to do is help to think about orthodoxy in light of the concept of tashabbu. And this is not something that I think people speak of enough, whether in academic circles or in Muslim circles. But tashabbu is an analogous concept, is a parallel concept to bid'ah, in that it is a mechanism for maintaining orthodoxy and Sunni Islam in particular. So the kind of the rulings, the exhortations of the Prophet that are associated with this doctrine, with this teaching, have a similar effect. That is to keep Islam, as it were, orthodox or correct Islam. And so this kind of model, this kind of schematic that I have here on the slide, helps us to understand that these terms, sunnah, right, following the way of the Prophet, the example of the Prophet; bid'ah, reprehensible innovation; tashabbu, reprehensible imitation. They have a function within Islamic tradition, and that is to maintain Islamic orthodoxy. Now, I want to emphasize that some people say there's good forms of bid'ah. In other words, there's not everybody, but some scholars believe that there are some good forms of innovation that do not take away and do not harm Islamic orthodoxy. And likewise, there are forms of tashabbu that are good and positive, and likewise do not harm Islamic orthodoxy. So I want to emphasize that as well. Right? Islam is a deep religion. It requires nuance. It requires thought. And I want to the best of my ability, convey that to you all. Does this make sense, Paul? What do you think?
Absolutely. No, it's all very clear so far. Yep. I'll let you know if I get confused.
Spectacular. Fantastic. I love to hear that. Okay. So that's the section on orthodoxy that I just wanted to share. Now, orthodoxy is a topic that one could again write books on, but I just want to sort of give a simple introduction to help understand the role and importance of tashabu within the Sunni Islamic tradition in particular. Now what I want to talk about in a little more detail is religio-cultural sharedness. And this is a topic I mentioned briefly in the previous presentation, but I want to talk about it in a little more detail because I think it's helpful for understanding and putting into perspective the subject of tashabu or imitation. And I think some of the viewers, it would be helpful for them to see this in particular. So here's kind of a Venn diagram and the sharedness indicated by the lines. I used to be a math nerd, so I like Venn diagrams and these visuals. So I don't know if it's entirely clear in this slide. It looks a little bit like it's washed up away, but especially this slide did not come through for some reason, but that's okay. What I want to do is this slide says alterity is a continuum. That's what it says on the top, even though it got cut off on the right part. So what I mean is that alterity or otherness, how we think of the other, right? The other being not you, not the self, is a continuum. It's not simply a black and white binary, right? In the Quran or empirically in our lives. Thinkers, religious studies thinkers, anthropologists, speak of the other and sometimes use specific terms to distinguish between different others. So you can have a distant other and a proximate other in relation to the self. So what does that mean? So, for example, in Quranic nomenclature, right, the kafir, right, or a munafiq, or the mushrikeen, in their most, I think, virulent forms, aggressive forms, would consist of the distant other, those who are, distant and distinct from this Muslim believing self. But then you have other others or different others that we can call the proximate other or the near other. And the best example of this in the Quran is the people of the book or the Ahlul Kitab. And I think this is actually helpful for a lot of Muslims. It's actually, I think, obligatory, a requirement for Muslims everywhere to have this more nuanced understanding of otherness. Because many folks think that it's either you're a believer and then you're just non-believers, and then everyone is the same, and you kind of paint everyone, all non-believers, with a single paintbrush, and that just isn't. That's not how the Quran treats otherness, and that's not how the Islamic tradition has treated otherness, and that's not how we today should treat otherness either. So I want to make this clear because I don't think I made it clear enough in the first presentation, and I think it's really helpful, and I think it's also very important for Muslims and non-Muslims, for that matter, to have this conceptual apparatus in mind. And something that I teach my students when we talk about interreligious cooperation and conflict, that otherness is not just black and white. We can talk about otherness as a continuum and as a spectrum. And a key term here is the near other, proximate other, and the distant other, which is washed out here in the slide, but it's there at the end of the arrow. How is anything confusing about this, Paul?
No, crystal clear.
Okay, fantastic. So the claim that I'm making, right, is the Quran portrays the Ahlul Kitab in general as a proximate other. This doesn't mean that you can't have individuals, right, that may act in such a egregious way as to place themselves as the distant other. And we certainly had that during the Prophet's time, where certain folks who were once near others acted in a way treacherously or belligerently to the Prophet and to the believers in a way that placed them as the distant other. So it's not as if people are all inherently, intrinsically locked into one of these categories, but it's a helpful kind of
because I just want to know, the Quran says that we can marry the women of the people of the book, Jews and Christians. We can eat their food as well, and that is not extended, I don't think, beyond that particular categorization.
Right. You anticipated my next slide. I have a better here as a way of connecting. So I like this statement from Abdul Hakim Murad in Traveling Home. Maybe you can read it, Paul. I like your. You
got an English accent, reading an English guy, because Murad is an Englishman, of course, a revert. He's otherwise known as Dr. Tim Winter from Cambridge University. There's a good book, Traveling, I recommend it. We can share bread and a bed with fellow scripturaries, unusual word, and there can be close neighborliness and conviviality. Precisely so.
Right. So this is, his kind of slightly lyrical, poetic way, however you want to say this, of saying that, the Quran accords and certain key verses in the Quran say, hey, look, it's okay to for a Muslim to marry a Jew or a Christian, for that matter.
I'm not quite sure what that food is supposed to be. That kind of toast thing with that dollop on the top of it.
Don't the Brits like their jam? I thought the Brits like.
Oh, it's jam. Oh gosh. Okay. Yes, this is true. Yes.
I'm gonna guess it's jam.
Yes. Let's be kind. It's jam. Yeah.
I do like my strawberry jam as well. Anyway, one of the survivals for my British lifestyle, I suppose. So this indicates the kind of conviviality, to kind of use the word here, that Muslims can share with some non-Muslims. Now, this kind of statement isn't accorded, or at least explicitly stated, with regard to more distant others. It doesn't mean that you can't necessarily have dinner with an atheist, for that matter. We're not necessarily saying that, but the Quran is trying to convey a message here, that the Ahlul Kitab are a special kind of people, and they have a special kind of relationship to the followers of Muhammad in their shared claims to revelation and monotheism. And so we need to keep this in mind. It's really, really important to keep this in mind, to keep this element of sharedness in mind. Once again, it doesn't mean just we're all the same and there's no distinctions. We're not saying that. But this sharedness is important enough for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to mention. And if it wasn't significant, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wouldn't have mentioned it. And he wouldn't have distinguished the Ahlul Kitab as a separate category from different others. So this is important for Muslims all around the world, especially in the West, for those living among non-Muslims, to keep in mind this broader perspective, this bigger picture, especially when thinking about the subject of tashabu, because I think for some Muslims, they lose this perspective when they kind of get lost in the tashabu traditions. And this is something that I try to do in my book, is to give the big picture perspective so that we can keep the discourse on reprehensible imitation within their proper lanes, as it were. Now, what I want to do now is go a little bit further than I even did in the first presentation with regard to talking about non-Ahlul Kitab folks. And I'm going to draw upon one of the greatest Muslim thinkers of modernity, Shah Waliullah of Delhi, and draw one of his most celebrated treatises, Hujjat Allah al-Baligha, or the conclusive argument of God, right? A very bold title. These folks were not afraid to be very bold and with their book titles. So I want to draw on this text because it has some very interesting things to say about how later Islam and later Muslims, for that matter, relate to what we call today, or what many Muslims call today, the period of Jahiliyyah, right? The pre-Islamic period, called the Dark Ages, as it were, if you want to draw upon medieval European history. Now, this is what he says about existing practice in pre-Islamic Jahili Arabia. Quote, and I will read this one. The Prophet had been sent to a people in which a remnant of the rightly guided practice still remained. There wasn't any sense in changing this and altering it. Rather, it was necessary to affirm it, since it would be easier for them. And what I appreciate about this comment is, even though today Muslims are talking about the historical period before the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, before Islam came onto the scene in Arabia, was Jahiliyyah, a form of a period of ignorance, a period of irascibility and a lack of self-control. Nevertheless, Shah Waliullah, keeping again a sober kind of striving for an objective assessment of this past, saying, look, yes, there wasn't Islam, but you know what? There were, in fact, many practices that were connected to monotheistic practices that were good, and that Muslims and Islam had no problem with. In other words, there was an element of sharedness even between the post Jahiliyyah and the early Islam, or what would become mature Islam. It wasn't a complete severing or a complete rupture. I'll go on. In other words, put differently, as he conveys in this, the foundations of the five pillars of Islam, right? The Shahada, prayer, fasting, charity, Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. In other words, he argues they were already in place before Islam, the foundations and their elemental forms. So with regard to Tawheed, he says, if you investigate their reports with close scrutiny, you will find that their great and wise men used to believe in the next life, the guardian angels and other things, and that they affirmed the unity of God, Tawheed, in a sense, right? So he's not claiming that they had full-blown Islam, right? That doesn't make any sense. But he is saying that it wasn't as if they didn't have, or they didn't entertain any remnants of these ideas either, right? There was a foundation on which a cultural foundation, an intellectual foundation, a social foundation on which Islam could be built, and that the Prophet ﷺ was able to do that. With regard to ritual practice, he says that in ritual purity, prayer, charity, fasting, pilgrimage, he speaks of this in this section of the Hujjatullah al-Baligha. He says that even these practices were observed in some degree by many, maybe not all, but many Jahiliyyah Arabs. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because it's sometimes not portrayed that way. Even with regard to social ethics, and this is came up in some of the comments, even with regard to social ethics, with regard to Jahili Arabs, he writes, and I'm going to cite him, customary practice among them was the entertainment of the guest and the traveler, supporting the whole family, giving alms to the poor, keeping the bonds of kinship, and helping those struck by the calamities of God. They were praised for these things, and they recognized that these constituted human fulfillment and happiness. Now, these are important observations that Shah Waliullah is making. And Shah Waliullah is an orthodox Sunni Muslim. He's not some sort of radical, antinomian Muslim that I'm drawing on. He's an orthodox Muslim. He's revered even today by Muslims in South Asia and beyond. So it's not as if he's a radical, as it were, in the negative sense, a thinker. He's very orthodox, and he's a Sunni, as it were. So I want to kind of just reassure viewers who don't know who he is and may not be certain of his authority. He is an authoritative figure, and he's making these observations based on his reading of the past. So this is important. These observations, I think, are important for us to keep in mind, because even not just with the Ahlul Kitab, what he's saying, that even with the Jahili Arabs before Islam, there was a relationship that later Muslim believers had, that they shared across ritual and social cultural practice. And I think this, once again, this big picture is very important to keep in mind. Simply put, when we talk about these relationships between self and other, whether with the Ahlul Kitab or even with, to a degree, the Jahili Arabs, we speak not only of rupture, but also of continuity. There was both continuity between Islam as we know it, as it came to be known, and rupture. There were certain breaks, right? The practice of burying daughters alive, that was an abominable practice that was common in pre-Islamic Arabia, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam objected to strenuously, as does the Quran. So it's not as if it was all the same, but it wasn't all different either. Once again, nuance and a sober kind of reading is important here. Okay, any questions on that section?
No, all clear, all good. Thank you.
Super, fantastic. Let me take a sip of coffee.
I like your they're very good, the images up here.
Yeah, I try to sort of connect the ideas that are in my head with some kind of image to the best of my ability, so that it's as clear as possible. Realizing that, especially for a complex topic such as this, any assistance I think is helpful. So, kind of building on this, I want to talk a little bit about the middle way. And now this is something that I think most Muslims have heard, and I think probably non-Muslims as well, about with regard to Islam, as a path of moderation, as a middle path, as not going to one extreme or another. And I want to talk about it in the context of, similarity and difference. So one way of thinking about the subject matter that we're talking about is as opposing vectors or opposing forces of social pressure. So in any social situation, one could go completely opposite and cultivate an orientation of opposition, or completely assimilate and have an orientation of sameness, of similarity. And these in some ways are opposing social pressures. But the Quran says very explicitly that we have made you a community of the middle way. Ummah wasata. I'm drawing here on Muhammad Asad's translation, which I liked, of this particular phrase better than the others. But a community of the middle way as a way of defining what Islam is and what it means to be Muslim, right? And I think this principle, which I don't think I emphasized enough in the first presentation, but I would like to in this presentation with regard to tashabu, is very important to keep as sort of that North Star, to keep as a guiding principle for how to orient ourselves and how to behave with regard to non-Muslims, especially in where Muslims are minorities. So another way to kind of think about this is how to think about identity. Identity is not simply comprised of just sameness, nor is it about being completely opposite, doing the opposite and being different. Rather, it's kind of this amalgamation of sameness and opposition, and then moments of contradiction. Once again, identity is way more complex than this, but this is a schematic just within the context of the concepts that we're talking about, to think about who we are as people. We're comprised of behaviors and acts that are similar to people around us, but that are also, in some instances, different and opposite from those around us. And then some moments we kind of flip back and forth. We're not necessarily settled. So this is where most human beings, right? We're not robots. We're not simply pre-programmed to behave the same way in every situation. It just doesn't work that way, right? This is the complexity of human behavior. So this is also important to keep in mind with regard to tashabbuh, similarity, imitation and difference. That how we behave as Muslims, as believers, as simply ordinary human beings are going to be a sort of admixture of these behaviors relative to our social environment, relative to the collectivities that we belong to. It's going to be some amalgamation of this. And these are the kind of choices that we're going to have to make, right? Am I going to dress in a way that, for example, would be very oppositional and very different, and so I'll stand out from the crowd? Or am I going to dress in a way, for example, that I simply blend in? These are individual choices that we make with regard to dress. But this also relates to our behavior, the way we talk, our character traits, our sense of humor. There are so many features of who we are that will be similar to and different from the people around us, and that ultimately makes us a unique individual. So the kind of upshot of this, and the kind of the point that I'm driving at here, is that when we take all this into consideration, the kind of emphasis on the religio-cultural sharedness that we see with Ahlul Kitab and even non-Ahlul Kitab, the exhortation in the Quran to follow the middle way, and even objective assessment of our identities and how they're formed, there's little evidence to suppose that Muslim identity is intrinsically oppositional. Rather, I'm arguing that it is not intrinsically oppositional. This may be a controversial point, and there may be disagreement on that, and that's fine. But I
think that is something that could be contested in France. I don't anticipate this now necessarily, but it's certainly perceived by the French state. I'm not saying it is, but it's perceived to be by the French state as oppositional to French Republican values. And this is not something the Muslims are calling for, this oppositional stance, but they are being portrayed as such, and thus they have to be censored and told to behave differently. So I think that oppositional dynamic is there in some places. I'm not saying everywhere.
Right, and so you make a good point, right? Here you're talking about, what I'm emphasizing here is sort of the kind of normative claims that Islam is making.
Yeah. No, indeed. I'm making a slightly different point than one you.
Right, exactly.
It's not intrinsically oppositional, and I'm making a slightly different point that it is perceived to be, which is slightly different, but nevertheless.
Right. But what happens, and as you're suggesting, if okay, you have your Muslims' relationship to their religious tradition, but what happens if you live in a polity or you live in a society where you are portrayed as the enemy, as the boogeyman, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
As the villain, as it were, right? What then? And so this is where you get into it becomes more complicated, because you're entering politics into the conversation. We're talking about representation, like media representations, literary representations, political discourse that now kind of comes into the photo, into the picture, and it gets very complex, and that's where there aren't any easy answers. So here, in France, you have a situation where the particular form of governance is I would say a very aggressive form of laïcité, a very aggressive form of secularism, right? That's different from the kind of secularism that we find, say, in the UK or in the United States, in a way that has alienated Muslims in a way that is unfortunate, and it's just that we now have a law not only banning headscarves and banning prayer in public spaces, but even banning abayas. So once again, it's ironically, it's very illiberal.
It is. I just think that
this deep kind of contradiction or aporia within the kind of French state itself, that it would kind of enact these kinds of rulings.
Yeah, for those who don't know, it just broke the news a couple of days ago that France will ban the wearing of the abaya. This is a loose-fitting full-length dress worn by Muslim women, and this ban applies in state-run schools. And it was very obviously targeting Muslim women, but the Secretary of State for Education very obviously had that on his mind, and he talked about how schools were emancipatory spaces of emancipation, depending on how I translate the French, where women didn't dress like that. So he was even saying that Islamic dress is oppressive and regressive and should be excluded from the emancipatory secular spaces. So he's being very polemical, and the state and religion are not supposed to be in contact, but he was making statements about religions and what they should and shouldn't do, and how people should and shouldn't dress. But yeah, it was a huge outcry against it, because what I find very interesting is, unlike before, when there was a big outcry from feminists in the West over the way Iran was enforcing women there to wear the hijab, and maybe they're right to protest. That's not really my point. My point is there's been no, as far as I can see, outcry at all, anything from feminists in the West about the French, imposition on women in France, telling women what to wear. So it seems to be very one-sided. Feminism seems to speak out when in service of a secular understanding of feminism or women's roles or women's dress, but when there's a religious, when religious women are being targeted and told what to wear or not to wear, then feminists, it would seem, due to their absence of saying anything at all, they're just not interested. They're not speaking out. And I think that many people have noted this as an inconsistency. if the principle is that women should be able to express themselves in the way they dress, then that is the principle. But it's not really applied like that. It only applies when in the way that it has, the way I've described with Iran, but not with France. And this is seen as an inconsistency in the feminist response.
Yeah, I think the distinction and the outcry is important to take note. I mean, I can speak most authoritatively, or at least authoritatively, from the United States, where I'm currently reside, and certainly the level of outcry isn't the same as it has been in Iran. Of course, the situations are different. There are some feminists that do that do speak up on behalf of these Muslim women who are being told how to dress and do speak, but their voices are not as loud, or at least amplified by the mainstream media as in
exactly.
other situations.
For example, the Guardian and so on have not mentioned. I'm looking at their coverage. There's been nothing. Whereas before, as you say, the amplified feminist protests against the hijab issue in Iran. Here, there's nothing. So it's not just feminists speaking about it. It's also, as you say, the mainstream media amplifying and projecting those voices so that we can all hear them. And that's not happened, at least not in the last 48 hours that I've noticed at all. And I don't suppose, the news cycle's moved on now. So I don't think it's suddenly going to erupt. I mean, the moment has passed. But it's very indicative in Western attitudes towards this issue, that when it comes to Muslims, then, second-class citizens, we don't really care, even when the principle is the same at stake.
Right. Yeah, and it's religion plays a role. I think ethno-racial identity also plays a role. The fact that most of Muslims in France are ethno-racially different from mainstream French. I think that also plays a role in the way that this subject is treated. And I mean, I think, kind of going back to your comment about liberating or emancipating, I think Muslim women. I mean, I think the hypocrisy and irony is evident.
It is very ironic.
We're going to limit to free them, and I think that I mean, it's one thing if you're just going to call a spade, we're just going to not allow them to wear it. We don't like it. I'd almost rather them say that than say we're going to liberate them. I mean, that's because that's absolutely ridiculous. It also assumes that these women don't have agency. I think that's one of the things that is very.
Well, that's the argument I noticed in France on my trips there. That is the argument, that they believe that Muslim women have no agency, that they are purely oppressed by men. Right. That's just a justification, which is quite bizarre. I mean, I've never come across this really. It's just not. This is like an urban myth that's used by militant secularists to rob Muslim women of their right to live according to their faith. And also I've seen some posters that the French occupation, during the French occupation of Algeria, that were plastered around the country. There's one particularly I often use in talks. It has pictures of women wearing hijab and not, and saying, look, you're very beautiful, take off your hijab. And this is in Algeria, telling Muslim women in Algeria to take off their hijab by the occupying French military. And this was only in the 1950s, which is in the lifetime of some people alive today. So what I'm trying to say is that nothing seems to have changed. You still have the same French state, governments have changed, but their relationship with Muslim women, whether it be in the colonies when they occupied Muslim countries, or the Muslims in France who are French citizens, which many people seem to forget, I've noticed, they're French citizens, are still being told to dress in a way that conforms with other different values. And it's remarkable. Nothing has changed at all in France, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it also draws the attention. I mean, one would think, why does the French state so much about whether a dress is, how long a dress is? Why? What are the stakes involved such that they would even care? Mm-hmm. I think that brings into the importance of aesthetics, right? The aesthetics of physical appearance, and the role that physical appearance plays in mediating political authority, and that's where you have the nation state today. It's the invasiveness of the nation state, such that for it to survive, as it were, or at least for its within its own logic, it requires a sort of conformity in public spaces to a particular aesthetic to reassure itself that we are in control, and Islam or whatever else is not in control. And it almost needs a reassurance for itself through the enactment of these draconian laws that are focusing on the body, right? It's about these visible displays of Muslimness, these visible displays of an alternative authority to the French state, what they perceive as an alternative authority to the French state to govern the bodies of Muslim women, and the need to kind of manifest the authority of the French state by saying, well, no, you must dress in this way. It's complex, but it's very political. It's very, very political. But it also, I think, brings into relief the importance of how our everyday presentation, right, our presentation in public life, even the way we dress, mediates various types of political authority or even religious authority. And these battles that we see today within France and Quebec, and even in the United States, you have had battles on these sort of sartorial matters. Can a prisoner grow his beard, a long beard? That went all the way to the Supreme Court, for example, here in the United States. He won that case. Wow. But so these kinds of issues are not. I mean, even though they get the most airtime in France, it is also, these kinds of conflicts are also happening here in the United States with visible forms of Muslimness as a challenge to the sovereignty or authority of the United States government, or secular government more.
But it's interesting, although it's true, it's interesting, the case in the United Kingdom, as you know, I mean, women police officers here in the UK are allowed to wear hijab. I've seen them. Right. Women teachers can wear hijabs, students at universities can wear, men can dress in traditional garb. It's simply not an issue. Actually, it's not like that the society collapses and Western civilization, is no more. Britain gets along. I mean, I'm not saying Britain is perfect, of course. There are many other issues. But on this particular issue, I would submit it's not really an issue, and the house hasn't collapsed. We're still here, thank you very much. And we're literally just 30 miles across the English Channel from France, which has a heart attack every time a Muslim woman wears a hijab. So it shows it's possible to have a more, perhaps mature, responsible attitude, and everything just carries on. And you can have a more easygoing, dare I say, Anglo-Saxon attitude towards this, which the French, for some reason, don't like to have. But it's their choice, but they're making it hard for their citizens, and that's not good for coexistence. They go on about diversity and all this, but it's not really diversity when you force people to dress in certain ways according to the majority of the population. But we can do it okay in the UK, and so I don't see there's a problem, really.
Yeah, and I also think there's, local politics happen, the landscape of local politics in France with the right and the far right, and Macron trying to display bona fides to appeal to maybe certain folks over there, because the right and the far right has been growing in France, as it has in Germany. And
probably will win the next. I think my prediction is Le Pen win. Yeah, I agree. So, by the way, but just Le Pen has stated numerous times that she will ban, as a matter of government policy, the hijab completely from France. Yeah. And it's not at the moment; it's just some schools and certain employers, if they're. But she will ban it from France, and that is a serious declaration of war, really, as far as I'm concerned, a cultural declaration of war against Muslim women. And I think it is quite likely, many comments, that she will become the next president, because Macron can't stand again. He's reached the limits of his ability to stand for office, constitution, and she's the main opposition, and she's more popular than him now. So I think there are very choppy waters ahead in Europe, very choppy waters.
Yeah, and France in particular, it seems. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're gonna, obviously keep moving on and see what happens. But the subject matter here, with regard to displays of Muslimness, is very much connects to these subjects. And one of the reasons why I wanted to explore this subject, because I saw that, even 10, 15 years ago, that these disputes and conflicts over the visible displays of Muslimness is something that is causing problems, and we need to understand what's going on better, so we don't have these kinds of draconian laws being implemented, because clearly it belies a kind of ignorance of Muslims and Islam. And I would say it's even a war not only on Muslim women, but in some ways you could argue it's a war on the Muslim men, whom they perceive will be sort of provoked and put in their place, that you don't have the control over the women that you think you do, right? And I think that's also what the state is trying to tell Muslim men, what they think they're trying to tell Muslim men, while erasing female agency in the process, which is very sad. So anyway, kind of moving on from this idea of oppositional identity into what practices does tashabu include. And so now, with that kind of broad, kind of background in mind, now I think we're, really positioned to to explore the kinds of practices that tashabu, right, the doctrine of tashabu, the teaching of tashabu, the discourse of tashabu has included. And what I want to focus first is on the hadith corpus. So in the book, I actually provide many examples and give a brief commentary on many of these ahadith, and then go into further depth into explaining them in more detail. What I have time to do so here is to kind of give broad categories that we find in the hadith traditions. What subject matters do these traditions, exhorting Muslims to be different, exhorting Muslims not to imitate, whether it's Persians or Romans or Jews or Christians or unbelievers, what kinds of practices, ritual, social, cultural, otherwise, do they include? So I've cataloged them here. And for those who are really interested, can read Arabic. There's books like 600 pages long that go over all the different hadith. So it can get really in depth, but I'm just giving a brief idea, a big picture idea of what is included. So manners of ablution, prayer, including the call to prayer. One of the fascinating narratives you find, for example, is how the adhan came into being, and the way it's portrayed in many traditions is that it was the idea of calling to God via a voice was something that emerged as a way to say, hey, look, we're going to call to prayer in a way that's different from the way Jews and Christians do it.
That's right, because Christians do it traditionally by the ringing of a bell, a church bell on a Sunday morning. You can still hear that everywhere in America, Britain. The Jews, of course, with the horn, the ram's horn or something like that. I forget the animal. But the distinctiveness was that the Muslims, and what a beautiful choice to use the human voice, which of course is much, much more beautiful potentially.
It's certainly beautiful, and it's one of the interesting facets of this research for me was to see, oh wow, to the degree to which Islam came into being because, or in relation to the existing religious forms around the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, a form of kind of religion making taking place. Anyway, but it does include ritual. It does include the call to prayer. It does include how one should kneel during prayer. Even manners of ablution are mentioned in traditions on some traditions on tashabu, to set apart the way Muslims do these things from the way other religious communities do these things. Manner of fasting. One famous tradition relates to Ashura, right, the 10th of Muharram, where the Prophet, peace be upon him, saw that Jewish tribes were fasting during this day. And then, some traditions then say, well, close near the end of his life, he encouraged believers to not only fast during the 10th, as the Jews do, but also to fast on either the 9th or the 11th. In other words, fast 2 days instead of one. So this is a common tradition that's given with regard to fasting, to show how, on the one hand, yes, Muslims are fasting like the Jews fast, but their fast is not exactly the same as that of the Jews, for example. Similar traditions about when to break the fast, for example, hastening to break the fast when the sun sets. Likewise, eating suhoor, right, the pre-dawn meal before dawn arrives. These acts, these habits, these practices in Hadith traditions are portrayed as attempts for Muslims to distinguish their form of fasting from those of other religious traditions. Greeting formulas, saying salam, for example, or how one uses your hand, or how one uses your body to greet someone, is also found in the Hadith traditions. Holidays and festivals, which holidays one should celebrate, which holidays one should not celebrate. Eids, for example. So Nowruz, we find Hadith traditions criticizing the observation of the Nowruz festival, which, you know, has marginal kind of religious connotations, but it's really about setting apart Muslim celebrations from those of others. Funerary rites, for example, whether one stands or sits down when a funeral procession passes. Sartorial matters. Now, this is a big thing, right? Dress and hairstyle, how one wraps a turban, how one grows a beard, how one styles one's hair, among other matters. This looms large in the Hadith corpus. Even manners of eating, whether you eat with your right hand or your left hand, for example. So these are all the kinds of practices that are encompassed by the doctrine of tashabu, of imitation in some forms of another. And I give this kind of overview. I didn't give it as a thorough an overview in the first presentation, but I think it would be helpful for people to see what is happening. But so many of these rituals focus on visible forms of Islam, embodied forms of Islam. And this is kind of part of the role of these tashabu traditions. So this is in the Hadith. Now, moving forward, kind of fast forwarding, I'm going to skip over several centuries to Ibn Taymiyyah, who wrote a very important work on the subject. And he's not really the first person to identify this, but he articulates it well. He articulates it comprehensively. How do we know when something constitutes a reprehensible form of imitation? So yes, one could look to the Hadith traditions and say, oh, the Prophet said this. The Prophet said that when Ashura comes around, you should fast ideally 2 days instead of 1. The Prophet ﷺ says in a Hadith that when you call to prayer, don't use a shofar. You call to prayer with your voice. So we can know certain things by the Hadith traditions. But Ibn Taymiyyah goes further and says that, look, he realizes, as did Muslim ulama, that cultural practices change with time and place. Not everything stays the same. So how do we deal with the fact that sometimes the practices of a foreign community, non-Muslim community, will change with time? And how do we deal with that? So what Muslim thinkers did is they kind of theorized using Islamic terms and what I call a socio-semiotic imaginary. I know that's a mouthful. But I'm going to challenge your viewers to stay with me and not go to sleep. So for someone like, for like Ibn Taymiyyah, he theorized that what constitutes tashabbu, right, reprehensible imitation, is what is defined by a shi'ar. A shi'ar is an Arabic term that we find in the Quran that refers to the distinctive markers or symbols of another community. And so this is what I'm referring to as, the semiotic dimension. Semiosis is the practice of decoding signs and symbols to find out their values and meanings. That's what the practice of that's what semiosis is. And so Ibn Taymiyyah, when he's theorizing, well, how do we know when an act is reprehensible for a Muslim to imitate or emulate? This for him is the kind of the guiding principle. So if, for example, it became in vogue for, I'm just saying hypothetically, Christians to wear yellow, right? And that became a distinctive marker of the Christian community in Mamluk Damascus. Excuse me, hypothetical. Then he would say Muslims should stop wearing yellow, should not wear yellow, because that's what the Christians do. That's a distinctive marker of their community, and we shouldn't wear yellow. That's kind of how he kind of theorizes this. So, for example, with regard to celebrating Muslim holidays, he didn't like, one of the things that he is particularly sensitive to is Muslims celebrating certain holidays with Christians in Mamluk Damascus. So he complains that, and as does his student Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, that Muslims are participating in Maundy Thursday, what we a Maundy Thursday, what they would derogatively call al-Khamis al-Haqir. They call despicable Thursday. Kind of mean, but anyway, that's what they would call it. So they didn't like the fact that Muslims were eating lentils on this day alongside Christians. So they shouldn't be doing this, they're saying. This is a distinctive meal that Christians are eating, and then you have Muslims going out there and celebrating with them. That shouldn't be happening. Kind of like if ulama today would get upset over Muslims having a Christmas meal, for example. This is a specific holiday to Christians. Why are you celebrating with them? So this is the red line that Ibn Taymiyyah draws to say, well, this is what constitutes reprehensible emulation and imitation, and what doesn't.
Because I remember asking an Islamic scholar in the UK about someone I read about, a Muslim who was invited by his co-worker at work to go to the co-worker's wedding. The problem was the wedding, the man was getting married to another man in a church, a Christian wedding in a church between two men. And the question was, could the Muslim co-worker go to this wedding, this Christian wedding? And ultimately the answer was no.
Well, yeah, I mean, and there you go. It's something similar, happening here. But I will say that this is kind of on the one hand, you could argue this seems like a maximalist position, right? To expand the realm of tashabu to these practices that the Prophet ﷺ may not have explicitly mentioned. On the other hand, it also limits it, though, because it limits it to only certain practices that stand out as symbolic and distinctive markers. And if they don't, then it's not a problem. So, for example, there was one time where a lot of Muslims in the early 20th century got very upset about Muslims wearing brimmed European hats. Right? For them, this was a visible, distinctive marker of colonized infidel Europeans, and Muslims should not wear them today. Today, however, the hat doesn't tend, at least in many social spaces, doesn't have that symbolic significance or meaning. So you don't find ulama writing fatwas and composing fatwas today. Muslims should not be wearing baseball caps.
No, I mean, although you're right. I was actually talking to someone early on who lives in Turkey, actually, a Muslim living in Turkey. He said historically and still today, what you wear, hat wear does symbolize things. So,
of course.
It used to be the fairs, of course, and then that was banned, and then they had to wear brim hats, and then but it still does signify, it does identify you as a particular kind of person, even in Turkey today, by what you wear on your head. Now, it might not be the case, obviously, in the West more generally.
No, absolutely. And this is, once again, very context-based. But for example, when you look at the history of the Muslim writings in the early to mid 20th century on brimmed hats, it was like one of the hot topics during that period. Yeah. Whereas today, there are other issues that Muslims are talking about. It's not about the brimmed hat, generally speaking. Now, maybe in Turkey, it's a specific context because of Ataturk and his ban on the brimmed hat. So maybe there's a valence there and a meaning there that continues until today. But the kind of writings, or at least the sentiment, today is very different from the way it was 100 years ago. On this subject matter, and I think that speaks to this speaks to Ibn Taymiyyah's theory, right? Because it says that things that are at some point deeply symbolic of another community, some practices can diffuse and spread over time. There was a fatwa, for example, in the 1980s by a scholar that Muslims shouldn't wear jeans because that is a distinctive form of dress of
the West.
The West. I mean, today you go out, you see Muslims wearing jeans everywhere, right?
And in Saudi Arabia, when I was there recently, in Jeddah, at least, and in Riyadh, there were women wearing jeans, I should say.
Yeah, I mean,
they existed, and they were going about their business without being in any way, molested.
Right, and there's nothing, we can obviously distinguish between tight jeans versus loose jeans, but once again, this is another practice that at one point may have been perceived as reprehensible and as a distinguishing marker, right, of a foreign community, but now has diffused and spread such that it no longer carries that same value and meaning. It no longer carries that significance. And so that's where Ibn Taymiyyah's theory, and really, I would say he didn't necessarily coin it, but the theory that Muslim ulama developed around this issue is very dynamic, right? And as an historian, it's very fascinating and very interesting because it shows that, yes, certain things stay the same, right? But certain things also change with time and place, and which is why you need thinkers to think these things through, to figure out what is good imitation and what constitutes bad imitation, because simply cutting and pasting from the past will not always lead to good decisions or good rulings. So this is a theory that I wanted to bring into to the fore, because it helped serve as a guiding principle for many ulama to determine what constitutes reprehensible imitation in a given time and place, right, and what does not. So one thing that came through in this first presentation and I think has come through in this presentation is, why does the Islamic discourse of reprehensible imitation of tashabu emphasize the distinctiveness of Muslim physical appearance? And this is something that we find throughout Islamic history. We find this emphasis in the hadith traditions. We find this emphasis in the treatises that and fatwa that Muslim ulama and fuqaha would write later on. And that has to do with, number one, the linguistic import of the term tashabbu, which emphasizes it kind of has an import of physical appearance. And what and there are multiple reasons. One of the explanations that I argue is that being Muslims cannot be reduced exclusively to a private, interior, abstract, disembodied experience. It encompasses a public, exterior, material, and embodied dimension as well. And I'm simply citing myself from my book. And this is one explanation that I give. Right? It's not the only explanation, but I think it helps to explain. It certainly, I think, goes far to helping to explain why physical appearance is an enduring, is a part of this discourse, is a part of this doctrine.
Can I just comment on that? It's a very interesting, because being a Muslim cannot be reduced exclusively to a private, interior, abstract, and disembodied experience, as has, however, I would argue, Christian living in society is now seen as a purely interior relationship with God or with Jesus. Your second part about it does encompass the public, exterior, embodied dimension as well. I think that's been rejected now in Christianity. And I actually tweeted about this, if I may refer my own tweet, just now, where I actually said Christians have forgotten that women must wear the hijab too. Now, this is deliberately clickbaity, but it's meant to convey a serious point. 1 Corinthians 11, the first letter of Corinthians of Paul, this is actually in the Bible, says any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It goes on. I won't get the argument because he develops why this should be the case. She should wear the veil. But he does say, actually, if a woman will not veil herself, then she shall cut off her hair, because it's like being a prostitute. You are. It's a dishonorable, shameful condition for Paul. Now, we may say it's all culturally relative, but that's the point. This balance between the interior and exterior, between the private and the public that you have mentioned there, is maintained in the Islamic conception of being a person, in the way they live and behave, but it's been lost in other religions, and that's a shame. I'm not saying this is triumphalist of Islam over Christianity. I'm just saying it's been lost in Christianity, but it has been maintained in Islam, thank goodness. That was all.
Yeah, and this is something that academics are also draw attention to, in part because modernity, Western modernity itself, and the way that religion has been configured, and what good faith is supposed to be like within a secular state. It's supposed to be private and interior, so that the state then can, as it were, have more control over public life. And the emergence of religious pluralism and certain theories of religious pluralism within democratic states they've argued that keeping religion private allows for the religiously plural state to be functioning and relatively conflict-free. The problem, of course, is that this is one of the reasons why I think there is difficulty in many secular states, whether it be France, whether it be China, parts of the United States, to accommodate Muslims, is because there is not always an agreement on what this public manifestation of religion should look like. And the reality is, when you go back to the early period of Islam and you look at these hadith traditions on tashabu, it very much indicates to us that constructing a public image of Islam that was very much embodied by Muslims was an important dimension of religion making. And I do in the book connect it to broader kind of political developments of empire, etc. But today, in whether it be in the United States or in the United Kingdom or in France or in China, this is very much a hot button issue. How does one physically embody their faith in public life? And no matter what one comes up with in terms of how Muslims should behave today, historically, as an historical fact, and I say this as an historian, this helps to explain why many of these tashabu traditions really focus on physical appearance in the form of physical acts, but also something like the adhan in creating a public space. And it constructs an Islamic public. Just actually yesterday, or maybe the day before, New York gave permission for mosques on Fridays and during Ramadan to publicly call the adhan via loudspeakers, kind of like Minnesota, I think what Minneapolis did. So, many Muslims were happy about this, although some Muslims were upset because the mayor permitted this 3 or 4 days after coming back from Israel. So some people thought it as a political move, as a calculative move to appease Muslim constituents. Anyway, it's a way of this. For many Muslims are happy about this because this allows Islam to be heard in the public in a way that it was not before, whereas Islam had to be silenced to pacify a secular state. And now what New York is saying is, well, we're going to make these accommodations for you guys. But anyway, it brings into relief these ongoing negotiations about how religious communities may publicly manifest their faith. And not all states are the same, as we see, for example, in China, what they're doing to mosques and requiring that they conform to certain new aesthetic norms that are, distinctively Chinese, as opposed to the way they looked in the past. It's about the state, and I would say a relative insecurity of the state to feel the need to project its power so that it's publicly visible in this way.
Although, a good point. I was in Cambridge last week, and I visited Cambridge Central Mosque. This is one that's been
it's a beautiful mosque.
It's an incredible mosque. Abdul Hakim Murad, who you've already mentioned, is the mind behind this, and it's been absolutely extraordinary. And even though it's definitely a mosque, it's not identifiably mosque in the way that you expect to see it, say, in Turkey or in Saudi Arabia. It's very much a beautiful, ingenious blend of English or British architecture with an Islamic flavor, and it works very beautifully, both inside and outside. And I think that is a really good way forward, actually, rather than having, in inverted commas, alien architectural forms just planted into an existing culture and saying, hey, it's just us. It is possible to find creative solutions, I think, which where everyone feels that they can identify with the building rather than just the people who use it. I mean,
yeah, I think it's a fantastic example, and we're going to actually, inshallah, loop back to this point that you make towards the end of the presentation when we talked about Muslims living in the West. I think it's a great point. Sort of in the conclusion of my book, I'm also advocating for something along those lines. So I look forward to kind of coming back to this to that point. Another big reason, and once again the slide is a bit distorted, but another big reason why physical appearance has historically mattered to the subject of tashabbuh is the sort of ongoing, or at least not ongoing, but the insight that Muslim ulama had from, and Muslims had, beginning from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that there's an intimate relationship between the zahir and the batin, right? The outward physical embodiment of one's faith and the internal cultivation of the self, that they're intimately related. It's very hard to kind of sever. One could sever the two, but generally speaking, they go in lockstep. There's an interesting tradition attributed to Ibn Mas'ud. La yushbihu zi hatta tushbihu al-qulub, that the people's physical appearances do not align until their hearts are aligned, which I think is a very interesting tradition attributed to Ibn Mas'ud. In other words, people's physical appearances come to be similar when their affections for one another are there. And so sometimes you see people that are friends and they look the same, they dress the same, or at least similarly, and it is a manifestation of the affection they have for one another. But Ibn Mas'ud here, if we can attribute this quote to him, is drawing a connection between the zahir and the batin. And this is something that the mutasawwifun, Sufis in particular, speak about. But even beyond, Sufi discourses, we find even among Islamic Muslim fuqaha, they recognize this insight. And this is something that is an ontological observation made by Muslim spiritual masters. And I think this is another reason why these thinkers emphasize the importance of having a distinctive physical appearance, because it would signal a distinctive Muslim character as well. Now, this isn't always the case. You do have, situations where there's a rupture between the zahir and the batin, and someone you may not be manifestly or evidently Muslim outwardly, but interior-wise or internally, they have a very close relationship to Allah and they're very devout. This is certainly true, and this certainly happens. But generally speaking, one of the reasons why I think physical appearance has been emphasized in the tashabbuh literature is that ulama again and again emphasize this interrelationship between the zahir and the batin. Any comments or questions about this, Paul?
No, not at all. Great, thank you.
So those are two big reasons why I think physical appearance has been emphasized in the tashabbuh discourse. And I wanted to explain this because I think some folks, didn't understand. And I also want to emphasize that part of the reason why we have this sort of, at least some of us get confused when we, with this emphasis on physical appearance, is because we've also become so modern that, faith is supposed to be interior. And we think that that's really what matters. And look, no one's saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ultimately he'll scan our hearts, right? In a way that no other being can. And he will determine, where we belong in the world to come. Obviously, the Quran even emphasizes this. Ultimately, what's really important is what is in our hearts. That said, in this kind of Islamic anthropology and the anthropology, I think, of other religious traditions, there's this understanding that what we do physically in the outward world does actually have an impact and does shape our interior. Okay, so what are some rulings on tashabbuh? and this is something that I didn't have a chance to talk about during the first presentation that I want to discuss a bit. This, by the way, is Qadi Abu Soud, one of the famous muftis of the Ottoman Empire, legislating and giving fatwa. I love his big, huge turban.
Some of those turbans are so big. I was wondering how they managed to keep their head straight.
I know.
The size of a huge tire.
I know. I think that during one of your podcasts or one of your interviews, you must wear a huge turban, Paul. I really, maybe you're doing a podcast on Ottoman history.
Indeed. Well, maybe for that, yeah.
Anyway, here's a statement attributed to Imam Shafi'i. We do not prohibit imitation, tashabu of them, Jews and Christians, in all situations. We eat like they eat. And I sort of foreground this here right off the bat to show how a figure that's widely revered in the Islamic tradition himself makes a statement about this idea of imitation. Being like, look, not everything is prohibited. So even if Imam Shafi'i didn't make the statement, even if this attribution is incorrect, which sometimes it can be when you look at the literature, the statement itself is true. The statement itself is true. This because the ulama did not prohibit imitation in everything. They just didn't, because of all the things I've spoken about before. Islam is a middle path. The religio-cultural sharedness with Jews, Christians, and even pre-Islamic Arabia, the idea of the Ahlul Kitab as the proximate other versus the distant other. For all these reasons I've spoken about, ulama did not prohibit tashabu in everything. It wasn't a call for opposition and rejection in every sphere of life. If that were the case, Muslims and Jews would not have been permitted to live in the caliphate, yet they did, right? This is for the general viewer to keep the big picture in mind. To kind of go beyond this and when you look at, for example, the discourses of ulama on the subject, Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, argues that the reality is tashabbuh can fall in any one of 5 primary Islamic rulings: illicit haram, detested makruh, licit mubah, recommended mustahab, obligatory fard or wajib. So he says, like, look, even when you see, it's not as if every instance of tashabbuh is haram. It could be makruh, detested. It could be simply permitted. It could be, in fact, recommended to emulate or imitate for an act of tashabbuh to take place, or even fard, depending on the context or situation. So Ibn Taymiyyah, despite his, I would argue, maximalist position on the subject of tashabbuh, still was able to have a nuanced perspective, and see that there are a variety of Islamic rulings that could apply depending on the context. It's not just black and white. And I want to emphasize this because in some of the comments and then my conversations with ordinary Muslim believers, like, no, tashabbus is prohibited in everything. You can't imitate them in any way, and in terms of their ethics, and that just isn't true. It's just a false statement. So if you don't believe me, then hopefully you'll believe Ibn Taymiyyah. So I want to emphasize this. It depends on the particular practice that we're talking about. Even in the case of the beard, for example, we have hadith traditions that exhort Muslim men to dye the beard. Even though it's given in an explicit command form, like the articulation in the Arabic is a command of the Prophet, that command for most ulama is not an obligation. Maybe it's merely at most a recommendation. So that's why it's optional, even though the hadith takes the form of a command, and one would, at the face value of the hadith, think that the Prophet is making affecting a requirement. That's not how Muslim fuqaha interpreted the hadith. And that's why it's complex. That's why reading hadith and developing or at least deducting fiqh rulings is just not a simple matter. Some hadiths are not even acted upon. So one has to kind of think through things, speak with folks that are knowledgeable on these issues before making blanket statements that are uninformed. Case study. I want to give one case study. Reading from a mushaf during prayer. So if anyone's gone to Taraweeh prayer, it's not uncommon to find people in the saf, in the line, having a cell phone during Tarawih prayer, which could be as long as 20 rakat or 8 rakat, but can last hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, depending on where you go. And in order to pay attention, some Muslims will have a cell phone with the surah that the imam is reading from in order to pay attention and focus on.
Could you just define what mushaf is for those?
Oh, sorry. A mushaf, excuse me. A mushaf is an Arabic term referring to the physical Quranic codex that one holds.
In Arabic, and it's not with commentaries and all that. It's just the text, isn't it, of the Arabic text?
It could have, it might have, commentary in it, of course, but we're really talking about, the Quranic text, the 600 or so pages in the printed form, God's words, right? God's words. That's really what we're talking about. So the physical copy is referred to as a mushaf in technical Arabic terminology. So is it okay to hold a mushaf during prayer? Right? In the Hanafi school, the general answer is no. So for Imam Abu Hanifa, it's a hard no. Why? For him, it invalidates prayer. So a strict Hanafi, you'll never see a strict Hanafi holding a mushaf, a physical Quran during prayer. Because according to Imam Abu Hanifa, excessive physical movement is prohibited, as is having external inspiration for reciting the Quran during prayer. Rather, when one is in prayer, the recitation should come from within, whatever the person knows of the Quran. It should not be externally inspired. And this is Imam Abu Hanifa's position. But his companions, the Sahiban, Imam Muhammad and Abu Yusuf, were also very well-respected scholars, and mujtahid imams within the Hanafi school had a different opinion.
Yeah,
they didn't. It wasn't a hard no. It's better if you don't. I detested makruh. Why? Their rationale was that it's tashabu of the Ahlul Kitab. To hold a mushaf during prayer is a form of imitating certain Ahlul Kitab. Maybe they're referring to certain rabbinic Jews that they were, within their particular time and place. But what's important to keep in mind here is that legal rationale, the illah that's given, was not strong enough for them to prohibit the act outright. And I'm speaking of Imam Muhammad and Abu Yusuf here. Rather, it was simply strong enough to say it's makruh, better if you don't. In other words, for them, if a Muslim did hold a mushaf during prayer, it would not invalidate it. It would simply be something that it's better if they didn't do. Now, moving from so you see this internal diversity within the Hanafi school itself. Although the dominant position with the Hanafi school today is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa, that it's a hard no. Still, I show this to show the viewer, all right, talk about this to show the viewer that it's such a subjective enterprise. It's not always evident what constitutes tashabbuh, and it's not even evident what the ruling should be. In the Shafi'i school, it's a different view. Imam Shafi, no problem. It's permissible. Because the tashabbuh is unintended. Even if it is tashabbuh, it's unintended, and it really has no legal force in this case. So even if it can be shown that this is tashabbuh, a kind of imitation of the other, for Imam Shafi'i, it nonetheless is not intended, and therefore has no legal force in determining the ruling on whether it's okay or not to hold a mushaf during prayer. So a follower of the Shafi'i school, the imam of the following of the Shafi'i school, can hold a mushaf during prayer and have a clear conscience and not worry that he or she, for that matter, in the case of a follower, is committing a sin. So you have this diversity over, whether an act is tashabbuh or not, and you have this disagreement on whether it constitutes or what the Islamic ruling should be. And so this is the kind of nuance and complexity that exists on the subject, and that we simply have to be aware of. It's just not a simple black and white matter. And this is just one case study I chose to help show, or at least to show the viewers, how this operates in the pre-modern Islamic tradition. Any questions or comments about this, Paul?
No, not really. It's just that there are things that are prohibited for men to do, like wearing silk or gold jewelry. We can't just copy Christians and wear, a silk shirt, a nice silk shirt from the shop, or a gold ring. That's simply, my understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's simply prohibited. So imitation there will be prohibited. So I don't think there's any ambiguity there. But but there is ambiguity on other issues, as you obviously have just illustrated. Would that be fair?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. There are some issues. I mean, I will say there is ambiguity on the silk issue, but because there is allowance among the fuqaha on certain amounts of silk that are permitted, but we won't go there to kind of go too far afield. But generally speaking, and then you also get into the percentage of silk. Is it 50% or less than 50%? So these.
If I was to say, that my friend Mr. Christian's got a nice gold ring on his finger, I want one as well. As a Muslim, that's pretty clear cut, isn't it?
Yeah, the gold ring issue, we would say that is not merely an issue pertaining to interfaith relations. That's also about gender, right? That's a gender issue, right? Because Muslim women, are permitted to wear gold.
As a man, though, I meant.
So you get into the gender tashabu here, the gender tashabu, kind of intersecting with the interfaith tashabu, which it gets really interesting when you get these intersections. But yeah, in that particular case, you're not going to find many ulama, or really any ulama that I can think of, that would say it's okay for a man to wear a gold, at least of a very high percentage gold ring. Now the question becomes, if it's a very low percentage, right? This is getting into certain legal principles within certain schools. What is gold? If something is less than 50% gold, is it gold? So you might get into some of these issues among some fuqaha about these matters. What is the identity of the?
But is that not a danger then, getting into kind of Jesuitical casuistry, as the Christians used to call it? I remember as a Catholic, you have this phrase, Jesuitical, Jesuit casuistry. In other words, kind of obscure arguments that kind of get away from the clarity of the point. Is it not the case? For example, I could say, one could say, Muslims shouldn't drink wine. And then the casuist may come back and say, it's not always strictly true, because you can drink non-alcoholic wine, if there was such a thing, or non-alcoholic beer, which there is such a thing. I mean, I could sit in the pub and have my non-alcoholic beer as a Muslim. I mean, but you say, but it's not alcohol. So, but I know these are possibly grey areas. But what I'm trying to say is that there is nevertheless a clear prohibition on alcoholic wine, on beer, just as there is a prohibition on having a gold ring. Even though in some exceptional circumstances you can think, if the ring has 0.1% gold in it. I mean, I have no idea. Maybe then it's permissible. Maybe it's not. I have no idea. I'm not issuing a review here. But it's not a danger here that we lose the clarity of the ruling in the obscurity of some exceptional cases. They tend to obscure the more transparent clarity of the main point, that Muslims shouldn't be drinking beer or men shouldn't be wearing gold rings.
Yeah, I mean, this is getting into the reality though is a lot of fiqh is it goes into this level of detail on a lot of issues, and some legal historians do argue that Islamic law is heavily casuistic.
But isn't this because, if I'm going to push back, isn't this because these are lawyers we're talking about?
Well, look, you make a good point about
because to do with law, aren't they? I mean, fiqh is to do with law, and what do lawyers do? I mean, they delight in exceptions, the hard, and what in this extraordinary circumstance? And all this is real. That's what lawyers do. They delight in exceptions. Right. But the ordinary man and woman is not a lawyer, and they're not going to be guided by that kind of logic anyway. That kind of sophisticated logic that they're going to be guided by the simple. Now, I'm not saying therefore we should all be simpletons, but is there not a danger here that the complexity and the obscurity of the legal mind kind of overshadows the clarity of the prohibition?
Yeah, and I think you're highlighting a more general kind of I think dilemma within legal legal traditions. Islam, Judaism and Islam stand out among religious traditions with a very sophisticated legal culture. And I mean, I think it's challenging for the ordinary believer. That's why I think for ordinary believers today, it is challenging. It's not easy to be Muslim if one really wants to go in depth into these subjects. Ulama would say, well, in these contexts, it might be advisable to then go to a specialist and ask for guidance. Another guiding principle one could, and I'm speaking now here more broadly, is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, encouraged ordinary believers to avoid what is doubtful as a guiding principle. Right? Exactly. So one could say, hey, look, maybe there are certain situations, or even ulama or fuqaha, that may permit non-alcoholic beer, right? Certain situations at a certain threshold, or wearing silk ties that up to a certain level. But as an ordinary believer, I'm just not going to worry. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to get into it. So that is, I think, a helpful for the ordinary believer, for the everyday viewer that's watching this and maybe overwhelmed by some of the legal terminology. That's that's one way forward. However, that can also become overwhelming. If one becomes so besieged with doubts on every single issue, then that can also be paralyzing. So unfortunately, it can be a guiding principle in some situations, and I would say it certainly should. But there are also situations maybe that do require consulting with those who are.
I'm not denying that. I'm just a question of how this is framed, really, for the average person like myself. If we're always, if even obvious things are framed as complicated things that lawyers argue about, then the tendency is, how can we take that seriously?
Yeah, and look, one of the wisdoms.
The example would be, for example, about not eating pork. Right. So we're not supposed to eat pork. But the Quran says in extreme situations, blah blah. And of course, it says that, and that's right.
Right.
But we don't go around thinking, well, it's sometimes okay to eat pork, isn't it? We don't think like that. We think, no, it's haram.
Right.
Because we're not ordinarily in a starvation situation in the desert. This is very extreme circumstances where they're life and death. Then it becomes permissible. I mean, I'm assuming this is correct. Then it becomes permissible to eat pork. Yes, actually. Sure. But that's not how we live our lives normally at all. And we don't think like that. We think, no, pork is haram. I'm not going to buy that bacon. I'm not going to buy that pork chop, whatever it's called. Do you see what I mean in terms of how we frame this in our lives?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're going to have the default situation. And look, one of the reasons, why there's this level of detail, and, Imam Abu Hanifa, for example, I mentioned, let me see if I can go back. These 5 different categories. Imam Abu Hanifa and the Hanafi school is famous because it has 7 categories. So they go even, further, right, to the level of nuance. And one of the reasons why they, did so is because life is also complex, and they also want to have. They're like, okay, look, if God is going to tell us something, we don't also want to overstep our bounds. This is the thing. If God and the Prophet said certain things are prohibited, hey, those are prohibited. But they were also wary of overstepping their bounds, and this is where they were. I think that also helps to explain why they went into the level of. They thought it was important to go into the level of detail that they did. That they, on the one hand, didn't want to overstep their bounds and make things prohibited that may not in reality be prohibited. Right? And likewise, and the flip side, they may wanted to have prohibited certain things that they believe that God would have prohibited in light of certain existing principles. So it's them trying to do their job. But you're right. What is if you go to a barber and they tell you that you need, you ask if you need your haircut, they're going to tell you need your haircut. So that is kind of built into the function of being a faqih. It's you bring up an important issue. Someone like myself who's inclined to these sorts of things, I love it. I mean, but I realize that for many folks out there, it can be overwhelming and can even be a turnoff, right? Because it becomes burdensome to have to think through every single issue in such a sophisticated level of detail. So that's why the one comment I'll make as the couple of guiding principles I'll say: avoid what is doubtful as long as it's not overwhelming, and then if in doubt, if you're confused, go to someone whom you trust. for advice and for guidance. But you're right, it is a pitfall. It is a potential pitfall to get into such a level of detail that you lose the forest for the trees, right? Or whatever it is. Yeah, you lose the forest for the trees. And this is always a pitfall. This is always a pitfall in these matters. That's where that's where guidance comes, right? That's why we say every single prayer, Ihdina Siratal Mustaqim, because ultimately we need God's guidance to get us out of those moments of confusion and give us clarity. And that's why even intellectuals, even fuqaha, need guidance. They need guidance so they don't lose themselves as many have in the past. So thank you, Paul. That was a great point. Now to sort of the Muslims living in the West, which I know is a subject that both of us are excited to speak about. And I think we've already touched upon many of these issues, but I want to think about how can Muslims today begin to think about the subject of tashabu, right? So I posed this question at the end of the presentation last time, but I didn't really try to answer it. I kind of just left it there in an implication. I think some people were maybe confused. So I want to try to address this, and I think I already have to some degree, a little more explicitly. Does being authentically Muslim require opposing mainstream American or British or some other culture? I mean, the short answer is not necessarily. And I want to actually bring once again Ibn Taymiyyah, who wrote this statement, who composed this statement all the way back in the early 14th century. And I think this level of nuance is helpful for Muslims, especially Muslims living in Western countries today. So I'm going to just simply cite what he stated, and obviously a translation from the Arabic. Quote, if a Muslim resides in non-Muslim lands, and he used the term Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Kufr, he is not obligated to appear different from his people, i.e. non-Muslims, in their outward conduct due to the potential harm that may befall him or her. In fact, it may be commendable or even binding upon a Muslim to participate occasionally with non-Muslims in their public affairs if it fulfills a religious objective, i.e. maslaha diniyah. If it becomes clear that the correct religious policy with respect to similarity and difference with regard to tashabu changes with time and place, then the truth of these hadith traditions does so as well. And it's a very profound statement that he's making, right? Once again, you see nuance, even though, you can argue that Ibn Taymiyyah had a maximalist position with regard to not imitating non-Muslims. He's still in the 14th century, early 14th century, despite the Mongols menace that was coming in and the sort of the suspicion he had towards Christians living in Muslim majority countries, had the vision and foresight to say, look, there are some situations where you just gotta think differently about this issue. It's just not a simple, prohibition. It may be, in fact, important for Muslims living in non-Muslim majority contexts, and his time, Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Kufr, to emulate and assimilate into the situations or the societies that they're living in. Of course, holding onto their Islam, maybe in certain situations hiding their Islam if it threat to their life or death. But in other words, there's a subjective dimension here based on maslaha, public interest, the religious, what is a valid religious objective. Depending on the situation, because he himself knows that he can't think of every single situation that a Muslim is going to face in the world, even in his time. And so he has to give this space to Muslims to figure things out and make informed decisions based on the context in which they live. And I cite this to reassure Muslims today living in the West that tashabbu doesn't necessarily require opposition to their surroundings in every sphere of life. They can be strategically selective based on the maslaha that they see. So for me, living here in the United States, I can only broadly talk about what it means to be French and not knowing what it's like to live in France as a Muslim. Here, for example, is some kind of guidelines for how French Muslims can attempt to function within this difficult space, as in China or in India. They have to kind of be strategic, and make decisions about what it means to assimilate and what it means to emulate. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, one-size-fits-all template that's going to work. What works for me here in the United States in northern New Jersey may not work at all for someone living in the banlieues in Paris. It may not. And I want to just give one example of a minimalist approach to tashabu today, of a modern scholar, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, who is a mentor to Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, and certainly fits into this Sunni traditionalist camp, as it were. I just want to give, once again, there are many different fatwa out there, but I want to just select his to give you an idea of what is out there. And this was recently publicized on Twitter. I even sort of retweeted it just to say, hey, look, this is what Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya is saying about this issue. So he, in this short 2-minute, I guess, fatwa, you can call it, or response to a question about tashabu, says there's two kinds of resemblance. There's permissible resemblance, mushabaha, and reprehensible imitation, tashabu. For him, most practices fall under permissible resemblance. He constrains or limits and what reprehensible imitation or prohibited imitation to acts that are, number one, intentional, and two, acts that apply to dini matters. He uses the quote dini in Arabic on purpose, religious matters alone. Now, this is what I would say is a minimalist definition of tashabu. Remember Ibn Taymiyyah, we're talking about dress, you're talking about signs and symbols of a community. Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, in his interpretation of this subject and his application today, and I want to emphasize he's speaking to Muslims today, believes that this should be the approach to tashabu. Now, not all fuqaha will agree with him, and not all ordinary Muslims are going to agree with him. But I want to just highlight this kind of minimalist approach to tashabu to see that is out there. And it's with a legit faqih of the Islamic tradition. Abdul Hakim Murad on Muslims living in Europe. This is also from traveling home. And he has a chapter on the people of denial, which you may recall, the Ahlul Kidab, as opposed to Kitab. He says the other's worth is intrinsic. Remember the terminology, self and other. So the other with a capital O, the non-Muslim other, whether that non-Muslim other is the Ahlul Kitab, a Jew or a Christian, or whether the other is an atheist. And he's actually in particular speaking to atheists. The worth is intrinsic. And quote, what is decently European and recognizably moral is also Islamically interesting, end quote. So once again, this is a position of accommodation. It certainly is not a position of opposition that he's endorsing. Although he does also say, quote, and this relates, and we're coming back to your comment about the mosque, right? The Cambridge Central Mosque, quote, we need to reduce the superficial outward signs that suggest that and he's talking to non-Muslims living in Britain, that we are exiles. So he takes a kind of a more forceful position that Muslims living in Great Britain and other parts of the West need to consciously and intentionally kind of tone down the expressions of foreignness. So once again, this is a kind of a more minimalist position that he's advocating about, expressing kind of the difference that we talked about earlier, about publicly manifesting one's difference. He's saying we need to kind of tone it down, especially the forms of difference that convey foreignness and alienation. I would, in my book, and just to kind of, I criticize this position a bit. I'm not as, I argue that, and sort of a through line throughout the book, that the forms of difference that Muslims may manifest do not necessarily have to be perceived as foreign. Like, not all forms of Muslim difference denote some kind of foreignness. And I argue that it's, and I think in part because of research that I did among Black American Muslims living in the United States and speaking with them, that I became much more attuned to the importance of letting Muslims figure out how they want to embody their Islam. And especially for Black American Muslims of a history of slavery and segregation, for many of them that I spoke with about this issue of imitation and difference, it was very important to be very, very visibly different in a way that was blatant, in a way that was obvious. That was different from many of the immigrant Muslims that I've spoken to.
Why was it important for them to accentuate their difference?
Well, it's for many of them, it has to do with the history of slavery and segregation, also the confusion around what is correct Islam. Remember, for many of them who follow, whose parents or whose relatives follow the Nation of Islam, and the idea that God was incarnate in the form of a human figure, for them to be very kind of visibly manifest about their Islam in a very kind of black and white way was important to making sure that this confusion wouldn't emerge again, and to visibly display their Islam and visibly display their Islamness or their Muslimness. So I was like, okay, I mean, and someone. So I listened to them, and this was kind of a very illuminating project for me, or at least research for me, as an academic, but also as a believing Muslim. So it's going to depend on many factors how a Muslim wishes to present themselves in public. So I don't advocate as strong as a position as Abdul Hakim Murad does here of suppressing those differences, but I would, at least the need to or the requirement to, I would argue that I think Muslims really need to be empowered. And this is something I would say to all your viewers, I would say to you, I would say to myself, we have to be empowered to go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and really figure out what our orientation is in the world and how we want to manifest our style of Islam, our Z, to sort of appropriate Ibn Mas'ud's citation, the way we want to, the style of life we want to live, the style of Islam that we want to live. That's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the same as even the next door Muslim, within bounds, right? I'm not saying that it's a free for all. No one's saying that here. But I think it's important for Muslims today living in, whether it's France or China or the United States or Great Britain, to take stock of what their situation is, to take stock of where their level of faith is, to take stock of what their knowledge of the Islamic tradition is, and to be empowered to go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ask for guidance on this issue, because it is an issue that requires guidance. But it's also going to differ according to level of understanding, level of faith, the specific political and social context that one lives in, the job, the profession that one has. I mean, these things all play a role in determining, how one will embody tashabu in their everyday lives. Some viewers may not like that. They may want like clear-cut answers, haram or halal. But I think if you're trying to, at least for this particular subject, if you're going to look for a one-size-fits-all solution, it can cause more harm than good, because of the potential consequences and the impact to one's internal character, but also one's social life. There are real implications for one's social life, cultural life, political life, and frankly, economic life. So those are some broad comments I wish to make. But I wanted to highlight that you do have certain respected scholars here arguing for a more or less minimalist position on tashabu, and that should give at least some Muslims today the space to to realize that, okay, it's not just black and white, and it doesn't mean I have to be an alien from the society or culture in which I live, especially for those living in the West. That doesn't, so I think that's, and then just coming back to the hadith and the man tashabbaha biqawmin fa minhum, the them here, and this is something that I emphasized in the first presentation. The other is something that is heterogeneous, and this is something that I do also encourage Muslims to reflect on. It's this tashabbuh is not about opposing the ethics of non-Muslims, and this is what one commenter said, that this doctrine requires that Muslims oppose the ethics of non-Muslims, right? And as someone who appears to be actually very educated and very deeply knowledgeable of the Islamic tradition, that's just not the right view. That's just not the right view. Because the reality is that there are some ethics that we share and with our non-Muslim brethren, some of them very deep and profound, about giving charity, about being good people.
Even something as basic as the Ten Commandments, which are found in the Jewish Bible, the New Testament.
That's a great example. That's a very good concrete example. Absolutely.
And even though they're not listed in 10 sequential commands in the Quran, they are actually all found in the Quran, funnily enough. That they are dotted around, but not in that particular way of presentation.
Right.
I never met a Christian or Jew who would dissent from that, or a Muslim. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery.
Right.
Honor your father and mother. Do not blaspheme the Lord your God. I mean, these are shared values, which the Ten Commandments are seen as the archetypal religious code by which civilized people live by. I'm not saying they're exhaustive, of course not, but that would be an obvious commonality that where Muslims are not going to object to the Ten Commandments.
Oh, absolutely. And there's so many others. And once again, this isn't saying that there aren't real differences. There aren't deep differences between many Muslims and, frankly, some other Muslims, and non-Muslims. There are, but we just have to, we're a community of the middle path. We are the middle community. We have a sober outlook on ourselves and the world. Sober in the sense of we don't go to wide extremes. And having that objective perspective is very important in this matter, because I think some people really lose that perspective. And I've met ordinary Muslims that have lost perspective on this issue and feel that they need to oppose everything in Western culture and Western society, to the point of,
it's also that there is an essentializing of Western, without going into a different subject now, a centralizing of Western civilization, Western culture, as if it's all one thing. It's
excellent, great point.
Homogeneous single thing called, I don't know, the Western culture of Texas, but it's not. I mean, the culture of central London is very different from that of rural Scotland, which is, believe me, is very different from rural France. Goodness knows what Alaska was like in Alaska. Never been there, or Texas, or Malta, or I mean, we can go through some very, very diverse cultural expressions, and they have commonalities, which is Western commonality, but to essentialize this and straw man it, another way of putting it, is a mistake. Well, Western civilization is very complicated. It has many tributaries coming into it historically, from pagan Greco-Roman Rome, of course, reborn in the Renaissance, Catholicism, Judaism, the local pagan cultures in Europe itself, in Germany and in England. I mean, and it's all a big mix, really. So it's very hard to even map out what being Western means, let alone to typecast it as a homogenous, clearly identifiable thing, is actually to simplify it beyond the reality. And that's also, but one can also speak about, things like NATO exists, to get political. NATO is a reality. Most Western countries are in NATO and they act with military force together. That's what they do. And one could talk about the Western military approach to Ukraine or to Iraq or to Libya, because these are realities. So I think one can generalize on some things when it comes to the military operations of the West, but other things as a civilization, that's very, very dodgy. There are many passionate Christians in the United States who would profoundly disagree with their compatriots on a whole bunch of other issues, who are secular people. Even in America, you can't talk about the American view about anything, really. Because there's a cultural war going on in your country at the moment, which is tearing the country apart. Trump, Biden, these are two tribes at war, cultural war. So what's the American view on anything? I have no idea, to be honest. So I'm just, as you keep on saying, this is a call for nuance and necessary complexity, but also recognizing there are some black and whites. There is this thing, there are pretty clear military alliances which tend to act together and do X and Y in the last 30, 40 years. You don't see people pulling out of NATO like France. We're not going to do that. No, they're all part of NATO. So it's anyway, that's my...
I think that's a fantastic point. I think it really beautifully put, Paul, and I, wholeheartedly agree with you. And, a point that I also want to make is we don't want, as Muslims, for those of us, we don't like it when people typecast us, as all Muslims are extreme or extremists, or Islam oppresses women. We don't like when people make those kinds of distortions, generalizations. And we shouldn't likewise do that either to others, right? If we really don't like it when people do that to us, because it can lead to hostility, right? When former President Trump says Islam hates us, whenever I show that clip to my students, I just start laughing. I can't help laugh, because to typecast 1.2, 3, 4, 5 billion Muslims around the world,
2 billion now apparently, but yeah,
but make such a statement, and for that to be believable, it's comic. It's comic. It's just, anyway. So if we don't want others to do that to us, right, especially as minorities, when we're vulnerable as minorities, then we also need to be very careful about responding in kind. And that's where I think the Quranic verse, the exhortation to idfa billati hiya ahsan, to repel in a better way, to respond in really the best way possible, not just the better way, but to respond in the best way possible. Ahsinuka kama ahsanallahu ilayk. I mean, these two verses are sufficient enough to have a whole nother session because of their beauty and their profundity. But this is where Allah is exhorting us and encouraging us to find the best way to act in any situation. And I think that's what we really need to do here with tashabu, but also with regard to treating the other, and how we think through the other. So rather than view the other as a monolithic singularity, we need to understand that there is a continuum, and this will help us, I think, will help ordinary Muslims to then understand what this hadith means today, and how to embody, right? I use the word embody deliberately, embody this statement of the Prophet in the best way possible for the time and place we each live.
I think, although I agree with you, I think there's a mistake, not your mistake, but to say that difference, I'm not sure Tim Winter's making this mistake either, to say a group of people are different, therefore they're going to be seen as strange and alien, and that's not good. I mean, the Amish in America, when I'm driving around the States, Philadelphia and whatnot, you have these huge Amish communities that reject modern technology, that go around in horse carts and speak a different language. Something, boy, are they different, but they're not seen as in any way kind of incompatible. Well, I can't speak for Americans, but I didn't get the sense that there was this, they're different from us, that they're viewed with suspicion and hostility. And so it's not all different, but I think the difference with Muslims is not that Muslims are the problem, but there's a civilizational clash that goes back over 1,000 years. I've been reading a lot about this recently in Western literature, Christians, by scholars, by philosophers, about the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. A huge amount of misinformation, downright lies promulgated about him is only changing recently. But my point is that there is this problem the West sees with Muslims, because they are part of a bigger historical civilizational clash in the way the Amish are not. So it's not difference per se that is the issue. It is what difference means in terms of this mega story that the West defining itself against the other, and the other is characterized, well, it used to be about the communists, but now it's the Muslims. And that goes back centuries. It's not Trump. Trump expresses that sentiment, but he's part of a long lineage that goes back nearly 1,400 years. And most of it, nearly all of it, is based on shocking ignorance of what Islam is really about and what Muslims are really like. So difference is not the problem. I think it's difference plus the historic baggage that goes with that particular different group.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it just highlights, the complexity of this issue. That not all differences are the same, and the kind of deep difference that you encountered with the Amish, and that's one of the reasons why. Look, I also don't want to sort of say Muslims cannot go out into rural Pennsylvania or Wyoming or Montana and construct a community that is very kind of nonconformist. If there are groups of Muslims that want to do that, then I encourage them to do so. But not all Muslims are going to follow the template. So a majority of Muslims are going to live on the coasts or around big cities like Chicago or northern New Jersey, where I live, near New York City, or California and San Francisco, which are very cosmopolitan, diverse places. And their expression of Islam is going to be not like if they had formed a community in rural Pennsylvania. But I would hope, and I would like for Muslims to have the freedom to figure out what kind of Islam they want to embody and where they want to be. If they want to live a rural lifestyle that approximates something of what the Amish do and have a very self-contained community, and if it allows them to worship God in a way that feels most authentic to them, and it doesn't kind of contravene the Sharia in obvious ways, then I would hope that they have the freedom to do so, to be honest with you. But at the same time, for folks that live here in northern New Jersey, work in the city, and work for corporations or whatever, where there is some kind of demand for some level of conformity, I would also hope that they can be authentically Muslim here too, and not be chastised for somehow being less Muslim, even though it may be a bit more difficult. So that's where I think there's different orientations that Muslims can have, and I would hope that as this doctrine of tashabu can be robust enough to encompass these different ways of being Muslim. And that's the kind of Islam that I would advocate, and the kind of application of this doctrine that I would advocate, not here in America, not just here in America, but elsewhere, where that kind of those kinds of manifestations of Muslimness are permitted. It may not be permitted in some countries like China or France in the same way.
Or the UK. We can go off the countryside and build a Muslim town. I think that would probably not be allowed. You've got the space in the United States. It's a vast, vast continent, unbelievably huge.
Yeah, excellent point. And I remember going to a farm some years ago. It's a beautiful farm where, anyway, I won't go into detail, but and I wouldn't trade that experience away for the world. It was just very, very beautiful. Is it the lifestyle that I'm going to live? I'm not going to live on a farm, but for Muslims that do, then that's great.
Farms are allowed. Is that the last slide, by the way?
And then Q&A.
Oh, sorry. No. Well, we've been doing that already. we've anticipated what you say. Yeah. I just wanted to share the book you keep on mentioning or quoting from, Abdul Hakim Miraz's Traveling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe. And he discusses many of these issues. One of them, for example, give you a clue. Where's it gone? Let me just get the chapter. But Muslims and national populism. So how do we respond to what's going on here? But British Muslims and the rhetoric of indigenization. That was another thing. So this rhetoric, how we got to become part of the nation state and become indigenous and so on. How do we, as British Muslims or any other kind of Muslims in the West, deal with that? But there's lots of nuggets in here, actually. Essays on Islam in Europe to continue this discussion in a more broader context, perhaps, but with always an eye to how we assimilate or don't assimilate. Because for people like myself, it's a lot easier to assimilate because we're already, but we don't have those kinds of issues to the extent we don't look different from the majority. But there are still issues in terms of ideological or cultural assimilation we're expected to undergo. In terms of our views of life and what attitudes we have, what concepts we have. And that for me is the sharp point where we are basically told to imitate, to copy, to assimilate the dominant population as it goes through, as it constantly changes its moral views and its attitudes towards all sorts of things. We are expected in lockstep to follow that and to imitate it. And if we don't, and that for me is a deeper issue about how we respond to the zeitgeist. And the zeitgeist is very liberal. The liberal zeitgeist is no longer the liberalism of tolerance and freedom and individual liberty. Today, the liberal zeitgeist is one of compulsion and assimilation in the hard sense. And that's happening here. By here, I mean the UK as well. It's not as bad as in France, but it's beginning to happen here too. And in parts of America, not all, but in some parts it's there as well, I've noticed. So, even those of us who are not perceived as other, we still have to face many of the same struggles, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's, there are these pressures, right? On the pressure on the one hand to conform and assimilate, coming from the state or from a particular, local culture that one is embedded in, right? So schools, for example,
Mm.
schools are often places of pressure because there's this demand to conform for children. And education is actually one of the things that many of the fuqaha in the 20th century wrote about, especially with regard to colonialism. And they were very afraid and very concerned about the kinds of educational institutions that were being forced upon colonized countries like Algeria or Tunisia, for that matter, because they viewed it as a kind of brainwashing of young Muslim children that would have lasting effects on future generations. So in some tashabu treatises against imitation, a major focus for some of the fuqaha, the ulama, were these educational institutions. And this remains an issue today here within the United States and elsewhere, the anxieties.
Yeah, recently, just a few days ago in Maryland, the court decided in Maryland, because there was some, I forget, they were Christian or Muslim parents. They didn't want they want the option to take their kids out of LGBT indoctrination classes because of their religious convictions. And the court there, the Supreme Court, whoever it is, a federal court in Maryland, the state in America, refused it. And they said, no, the children must attend these classes.
Yeah.
So parents are losing their right to see their children brought up in the way they see fit. And the state is now determining what the children should believe, even when it touches matters of faith. And this is a very, very sinister move. And this is happening in America. Imitation there is becoming compulsory. It's not an option. No, shall we imitate these people?
Right.
You have no choice. You've got to imitate these people because the court has said, and if you try and take your kid out of the class, you'll go to prison or something. You'll be punished because it's now the law. So imitation becomes a moot point then when it's compulsory.
Right. And this is something, the education of Muslims is an issue in Great Britain, France, Germany, even with the apparent brainwashing that's going on in China of the Muslim population. Education is one of those areas in which tashabbu really is a salient issue. The idea of resembling or coming to imitate whoever it is that you're imitating. So these are complex issues, and I bring up the education matter because it is something that is certainly relevant today, but was also relevant to Muslims living in colonized countries. Even in India right now, Muslim educational institutions are being scrutinized, for example, as places where what kinds of forms of Islam are being taught in those education. We're not even talking about madrasas, but like universities. Aligarh Muslim University, for example, Jamia Millia, I think it's, for example. So this issue of education is a widespread issue in the Ummah right now, but it very much relates, as you said, to this idea of imitation, because when you're young and you're impressionable, there are all these pressures and institutional pressures to force you to believe in what you're being taught, right, by the teachers and the curriculum. And I remember when I was growing up here in the United States, I didn't really have much exposure to Islamic history at all, and certain things that I just thought were normative were taught to me. These are the facts of history, and these are the facts of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example. I didn't have exposure to many of the sources of knowledge that I would later have exposure to that helped me to have a different view of the world. And I think that certainly can impact young Muslims in terms of their perception of themselves, but also their perceptions of Islam and how to embody Islam. So tashabbu here is very much at play, and it's something that I think is going to be a hot button, an enduring issue and dilemma for Muslims.
I think that it's resisting enforced imitation is actually a theme as well, because it's forced assimilation, ideological, controversial forced assimilation, whether it be China or Britain or France. That's on the agenda clearly, and people are. I mean, the options are very limited here. They're non-existent in France, but in America you can homeschool to some extent, I believe. But
Yes.
Which is something, but in many other countries in the West, it's not possible at all. In fact, it's a crime. You will go to prison in places like Germany and others where it is actually a crime.
In the UK, what's the view on homeschooling in the UK? Are you familiar?
I don't think it's possible.
Really?
I don't know anyone who does it, but I could be wrong on that. Okay, I'm going to take a pass on that because I don't know. But I do know it's not possible in many European countries, that's for sure. The government in France recently made an offence to even do that. We'd withdrawn that option specifically because of Muslims, of course, who were seeking to not imitate the zeitgeist, and that we're going to close that one down. Anyway, so it depends, like you're saying, it's context dependent. The experience of Muslims in the States to be different than it is in Europe in terms of how they can not engage, how they can resist enforced imitation of non-Muslims.
Yeah, and there's also the element of social conformity with their peers, now beyond ideology, but I mean that's another aspect of school.
Yeah.
The pressure coming from your peers of what it means to be cool, for example, that also it can exert a lot of pressure on young Muslims on how to be. So that's why this education imitation is really, I think it's one of the really important areas where I think we need thinkers to think about tashabu in the context of education, in particular. That there just has not been enough written about it. The broader subjects, yes, like what we've discussed to some degree, but within the context of education, I think we really need some of the best thinkers on this matter to think it through and to give guidelines to ordinary Muslims especially in the context of education, and how to kind of navigate these stormy waters.
Okay, I guess we're drawing to a close now. I will put a link to the book you've been talking about, The Muslim Difference, where we discuss Muslims imitating non-Muslims. It's a very readable book, fascinating, obviously very relevant to our context in the West. Well, there's a lot there. I look forward to seeing the comments, as always, in the comments below and see what people make of this, because I think it's a fascinating discussion. As I thank you very much indeed, Dr. Youshaa Patel.
Always a pleasure, Paul, to be here. Very happy that we stumbled upon free monotheist. Is that the official blogging theology? You're the free
monotheist is my Twitter handle. Yeah.
But blogging theology, and just a very
free of shirk and free of anyway. Yes, thank you very much. Well, thank you for being on, and inshallah you'll be a guest on it again. But thank you very much indeed, and until next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.